Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to talk about the Donbass and about what has been going on in Ukraine ever since 2014 and how this all escalated into this year's conflict, because I know that a lot of people are confused about this, especially people who are not Russian or Ukrainian. It's very understandable because it is a very lengthy and complicated topic, and on top of that, again, it is one phenomenon in which we have two completely opposite narratives, one coming from Ukraine and from most official world sources, and another completely different narrative coming from Russia. So I have done a lot of research for this video. I have something like 30 pages of notes, and I want to talk about my sources immediately. Most of my claims and statements come from very reliable sources, mostly coming from those very sources that I mentioned in my previous videos, which are considered to be some of the most reliable and accurate news outlets worldwide, such as the BBC, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, and a number of other ones. And for every statement that I make, I'm going to show you my direct sources, either by showing them on screen or by leaving the link in the info box. I'm going to leave every single link that I used in order to make this research so that you might verify them yourselves. In addition to that, I also had the privilege of directly speaking to some Ukrainian people. I am not going to say who they are, of course, because I am going to protect their privacy, obviously. But yeah, and by the way, I want to thank them for sharing their insight with me, because these are two people who are both born and raised in Ukraine and who witnessed firsthand what has been going on. I'm really thankful for the fact that they chose to share their perspectives and their stories with me. And so I'm gonna try to be as concise and brief as I can, even though, like I said, this is a very complicated topic and there is just so much to say. First of all, I just wanted to restate who I am and what my qualifications are, because even though I talked pretty extensively about this in my first video, apparently there was some confusion online about this, so I'm just going to repeat that. My name is Martine. I was born and raised in Italy. I moved to the US when I was 19 and I graduated from NYU in 2020. I graduated magna cum laude, and I also received the Founders Day Award for being among the top students to graduate from Tisch School of the Arts that year. My major was film and television, my minor was Russian and Slavic studies, and on top of that, I was going to pursue a second minor in politics, but unfortunately I did not have the time to complete all the requirements. However, I did take political theory with Professor Paul Aarons Nomo, and I also took international politics with Professor Bruce Bueno de Mesquida. Both amazing professors, you can read about them online. Additionally, I spent a summer semester in Moscow studying at Lomonosov Moscow State University, where I studied Russian language, Russian culture, and phonetics, and all courses were taught in Russian. So those are my qualifications, and now let's just get into it. So a bit of preliminary information that I think should be obvious for everyone, but maybe not, so I'm just gonna say it. Ukraine has been an independent country ever since 1991, which, as you might recall, is the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. So, and more in detail, a popular referendum was held in Ukraine on December the 1st, 1991, asking people whether or not they agreed that the country should be independent. And the citizens of Ukraine expressed overwhelming support for independence. So again, Ukraine has been an independent country since 1991. So one of my Ukrainian friends was kind enough to draft a brief timeline of the major events that took place ever since pretty much the end of 2013 to the present day, and it goes like this. So this all started with the Euromaidan protests, which began in November 2013. The second point is the Revolution of Dignity, which took place in 2014. So next we have the annexation of Crimea also in 2014, war in the Donbass, which also started in 2014, and finally we have the full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine as of 2022. So in November 2013, popular protests, now known as the Euromaidan Protests, began in Ukraine, and they were sparked by the government's sudden decision to not sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, choosing instead closer ties to Russia. The president of the Ukraine at the time was Yanukovych, and he was the one who supposedly decided overnight to not sign this agreement, and instead he accepted the so-called bailout money, 2 billion out of a 15 billion package offered from Russia as per the December 2017 Ukrainian-Russian Action Plan. The majority of the people were obviously against this move, and popular protests broke out. Protesters clashed with the police, who unleashed extreme brutality over the protesters, including the use of sniper rifles. And they consequently, as you can guess, caused a bloodbath. Next, on February the 21st, 2014, Yanukovych came to an agreement with the parliament, which allowed for the creation of an interim unity government, which basically means a provisional government. Fun fact, such a measure has actually existed ever since the times of ancient Rome, and it basically consists in, again, a temporary government that is installed during times of great social unrest or emergencies and so on. But shortly after, Yanukovych actually fled Ukraine and sought asylum in Russia. And at that point, the parliament voted to remove him from office. And by the way, he was later placed on the country's most wanted list and charged with a criminal case on mass killings of civilians. Interim government then finally signed the EU Association Agreement, and Poroshenko was elected president by popular vote. These events constituted the so-called Revolution of Dignity, and next we have the fact that in response to this revolution, some protests broke both in eastern and southern Ukraine, and we're still in 2014, just so you understand, both for and against the revolution, meaning both for and against the new government. On February the 23rd, clashes erupted in Kharkiv between both pro and anti-government rallies, and this is very important. Some people claim that local separatists in eastern and southern Ukraine were directed and financed by the Russian security services, which provided them with weaponry as well as manpower. And we're going to talk about this more in detail later, but I just wanted to make that clear. So this is something that multiple official sources talked about, as well as multiple eyewitnesses who claim that in some cases there were traveling groups of Russian people who actually disguised themselves as locals. So Putin's reaction to all of this was to call the new government led by Poroshenko a military seizure of power and a coup. And by the way, in the words of a UK professor in Ukrainian studies, Taras Kuzio, who wrote a number of books and articles and essays on the topic, Putin and the Kremlin believe Ukraine is ruled by a fascist junta that came to power in the Euromaidan Revolution and transformed the country into a US puppet state. Now we're going to talk specifically about Crimea, and this is a very interesting moment, because on March the 1st, Sergei Aksyonov, I don't speak Ukrainian, so I may be pronouncing these names wrong, so forgive me if that's the case. He formally asked for help from Putin to help ensure peace in Crimea. However, keep in mind that Aksyonov was an unofficial pro-Moscow leader in Crimea. The same day, Russia's parliament approved a request from President Putin to deploy Russian troops to Ukraine. We're gonna talk later on about Putin's theories about why Ukraine and Russia basically belong together, how Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus are actually one people, and that is why they should belong together, but that is a bit different. Right now, we're just gonna stick to the facts. And so by March the 2nd, Russian troops had complete control over Crimea. And I just want to specify, because I know that some Russian people, some Russian nationalists that I have talked to have claimed that, for all these years, for the past 8 years, the West has had no interest whatsoever in what was going on in Ukraine. And right now, ever since February the 24th, everybody just suddenly woke up and started saying, oh, Russia is invading Ukraine and all of that. That is incorrect. Many official sources and newspapers in the so-called West actually call the very annexation of Crimea as a de facto invasion of Ukrainian territory by Russian troops. So I just wanted to make that clear. And by the way, another myth that I want to debunk right now is the fact that a lot of Russians right now are particularly angry at the US over the sanctions that have been applied to Russia ever since this conflict with Ukraine began, and that continue to be applied, especially after the beginning of the so-called special operation in Ukraine. And I had one person in particular write to me in the comment section under my previous video that, oh, you can thank Biden for all of his sanctions, by the way. And I just wanted to specify that the US is not the only country that has been sanctioning Russia over the last 80 years. Not at all. And I have the full list of all the countries that have actually been sanctioning Russia ever since. There are 69 countries in total, ranging from the US to, and I'm just gonna read a few ones to you: Albania, Argentina, Armenia, Australia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Bulgaria, Canada, the Republic of Chad, Chile, China, Colombia, Cuba, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Hungary, Iceland, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Afghanistan, Israel, Italy, Japan, Kazakhstan, Latvia, and more and more. And of course, I'm not gonna read to you all of them, but I'm gonna leave the list so that you can actually read that yourself. So yeah, it is another myth that it's just the US and Europe who have been sanctioning Russia. This is part of the narrative that the Kremlin has been putting forward, that this is not actually a war between Ukraine and Russia, but rather a war between the US and Russia, and that it was caused by the US. So yeah, but more about that later on. So the annexation of Crimea actually violated not only international law, but also a number of agreements that Russia had stipulated with Ukraine over the years, such as the 1991 Białowieża Accords, again, pardon my pronunciation, the 1975 Helsinki Accords, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, and the 1997 Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And in the words of the Associated Press, which you might recall is considered by several different sources to be one of the most reliable and objective news outlets in the world, when Ukraine's Moscow-friendly president, meaning Yanukovych, of course, was driven from office by mass protests in February of 2014, Russia responded by annexing Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. It then threw its weight behind an insurgency in the mostly Russian-speaking eastern Ukraine region known as the Donbass. And by the way, a ceasefire agreement was signed on September the 14th, but it only lasted a few months. And another thing that I want to say is that in my experience, a lot of Ukrainian people speak Russian, not even as a second language. They were actually raised bilingual, and my personal friend from Kiev is such an example. She and I always spoke in Russian. She is absolutely fluent in Russian. Every time that I heard her talking to her family, her mother, she always spoke in Russian and never in Ukrainian, actually, even though of course she is absolutely against Putin and against Russia at the moment. She was raised bilingual, and I believe this is the case for the majority of Ukrainian people. And again, she was not even from the east or south of Ukraine. She was from Kiev. So as we'll see later on, this is another myth that Russian speakers in Ukraine were being supposedly. And also, according to several international sources, including the Associated Press, Putin was actually employing the rebel regions as a means to stall Ukraine's decision to join NATO. On March the 16th, a referendum was held in Crimea to determine whether or not it should stay part of Ukraine or become part of Russia. And this is where it gets very controversial because according to Putin and to Russian media, an overwhelming majority of voters, amounting to 97% of voters, chose to join Russia, whereas according to Ukraine and to multiple international sources, this was not a legitimate referendum for the reason that by that time Russian troops were already in Crimea, and there are rumors that of course voters were forced into voting to become part of Russia by the military that was stationed in Crimea at the time, the Russian military. As you may know, the UN called the referendum illegal and has to this day refused to acknowledge Crimea as part of Russia. Next. In April of 2014, armed Russian-backed groups seized government buildings across Donetsk and Lugansk. Actually, it's Lugansk in the Russian pronunciation, and it's Luhansk, I believe, in the Ukrainian pronunciation. So, and these two regions are commonly referred to as the Donbass. And at that point, the Ukrainian government, which again was led by Poroshenko at the time, sent its troops to quell the unrest in what was called an anti-terrorist operation. Order was briefly restored in regions such as Kharkiv and Odessa, though pro-Russian disturbances such as bombings continued throughout the year. So at this point, I feel like it's important to switch for a second to the direct testimonies from my Ukrainian acquaintances, because I do understand that it gets very confusing, and it just is a very confusing and very complicated part of the story, because even in the so-called Western press, there's still not a very definitive agreement as to whether this conflict in the Donbass was a civil war between the Ukrainians who were pro the new government led by Poroshenko versus Ukrainians who were against this government, or whether it was Russian aggression against Ukraine that was disguised as a civil war. So I'm just gonna read to you from the direct words of my two friends. First one said, in regards to the Donbass, there wasn't and there isn't any civil war. It is a war in the Donbass region, a Russian aggression. The war started in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. And from February the 24th, 2022, Russia began a large-scale war against Ukraine. The self-proclaimed People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Lugansk are Russian proxy entities. Russia wanted Ukraine to officially recognize the People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Lugansk, and that their respective representatives had the right to vote in the Ukrainian parliament so that Russia would be able to control Ukraine. Ukraine is never going to recognize the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. The territories of the Donbass and of Lugansk are, of course, part of Ukraine. Crimea is obviously part of Ukraine. We never invaded Russia, and we don't need anything that does not belong to us. We are simply defending our land and our people. The People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk are simply Russian proxies. This is a very short and sweet summary of what happened versus my more in-depth description. And again, you can see that the so-called narrative of the Ukrainian civil war, which is the narrative that has been brought forward by Russia, Putin, Russian media, and Russian officials is debunked as a myth that was simply meant to justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now I'm gonna move on to the second testimony. This one is more in-depth, and most importantly, it talks specifically about these pro-Russian people that allegedly were present in the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine. This person, who by the way is a lawyer, says, in 2013, the Euromaidan protests began because Yanukovych, the president at the time, basically changed his mind overnight about Ukraine's entrance into the European Union Association Agreement. Changed his mind in favor of closer ties to the Russian Federation. People did not like this, and young people started protesting. So at that point, Yanukovych started employing force against the protesters, and at that point Berkut started beating up people on the Maidan Square. By the way, Berkut was the name of a special police force that was particularly notorious for employing very violent measures, particularly against opposition to the government. We, meaning the Ukrainian people, were fed up by the total corruption, and basically everyone was for the Maidan protests, especially after young people had been beat up by the police. We were hoping that our entry into the European Union would free us from this corruption and open up international markets. As the leader of the country, as a responsible leader, Yanukovych should have created a popular referendum in order to solve this issue, but unfortunately he chose violent measures instead. This led to a conference between Yanukovych and several representatives of the Russian Federation, and in the end, Yanukovych fled to Russia, and at this point in Crimea, some people wearing green uniforms without any signs showed up and started conducting this referendum in order for people to decide whether to join the Russian Federation or not. And she writes, you can understand by yourself what kind of referendum this was. And she also says, I know many people from Crimea who were against the Russian Federation, but they could not oppose the Russian military in any way. She also says that at this point, meaning in 2014, she was living and studying in Kharkov, where they were also having meetings and referendums in order to decide whether to form in an independent popular republic. And this is a very important moment where she writes, I was very curious because I had participated in the Maidan protests, and I was genuinely curious to see who in the region of Kharkov could have been pro-Russian and who could have been wanting to be part of the Russian Federation. I could not understand how one can live in Ukraine while at the same time wanting to belong to a different country. Obviously, if you want to go somewhere, then you take and you leave. I went, I looked, and there were simply some drunk people drinking beer, hanging out. Even though in Kiev at the time of the Maidan protests, there were also white-collar people such as business people. She also says, I know the type of accent that people from Kharkov have, and I know because I used to live there, and these people did not have such an accent. She ran away fearing for her safety, of course, and after walking for a few blocks, she saw some buses having Russian numbers written on them. And so she says, I came to the conclusion that these were people that had been sent from Russia to paint a certain picture. And I think at this point we're gonna wrap this up. I don't want to just overwhelm people with information. Thank you for watching this video, And I just want to say I have spent a lot of time and energy in researching things for this video, taking notes, in verifying all of my sources. So I would be really grateful if you could like this video and subscribe to my channel. If you like this video, my channel is not being monetized at this point, so I'm really doing all of this for free, and just because I really want to provide real, reliable information to people. And I was very honored to be able to share some actual testimonies from Ukrainian people, because I think that at least for Western people right now, their voices are not being heard, or they're not being heard enough. So if you have any questions, or if you want me to expand on some of the themes that I briefly touched in this video, just leave a comment, let me know. You can also reach out to me on my Instagram. Thank you for watching this video to the very end. Again, let me know what you think, what you would want me to talk about, and I hope to see you all very soon.